Dr. Petra Tschakert is Centenary Professor in Rural Development in the UWA School of Agriculture and Environment. She'll take us through to lunch with a look at the social science side of things. Petra trained as a human environment geographer with a background in arid lands resources sciences and applied anthropology, working mainly on climate change adaptation, social and environmental justice, inequalities, and rural livelihoods and livelihood security in a development context. She was coordinating lead author of Chapter 5, Sustainable Development, Poverty Eradication and Reducing Inequalities of the IPCC Special Report on 1.5 degrees global warming. Previously, she was the contributing lead author on the IPCC's 5th assessment report on Chapter 13, Livelihoods and Poverty, and was part of the core writing team of the synthesis report. So you get an idea of how happy we are that someone of this calibre and insight is with us here today, because she's here today to talk to us about the vital element that we've touched on a little already in passing of the societal impact of farmers needing to constantly adapt to a changing landscape. Would you please welcome Petra Tschakert.
Hello everybody, I'm excited to be here, so please stay with me before you think about lunch. So this is about farmers, and I suppose this is about you, this is about us. I'm not qualified to talk about the land or the crops or the soil. This is about farmers, it's about farmers' resilience, and it's about the changing reality that affects what we can do and what we possibly cannot do. This is not a wallpaper. Does anybody want to guess? Barcodes, yes. Keep going. Rainfall, right? So you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see what's happening here. These are rainfall data for Australia. And you can see, should see here, 1910 to 2018, sorry, not rainfall, temperature for Australia. Take it back. So the first change and the first changing reality I want to talk about is climate change. And I can tell you that the science is clear. Climate change is unequivocal. And the anthropogenic, the human-made element in climate change is unequivocal. And this is one way of seeing it. If you're more used to graphics like this is the exact same information. The red, of course, is the increase in temperature. We can clearly see a trend here. This is an example of January temperature, and you can see the 2019 at the very right-hand side of the graph sticking out like nothing else. That's the January 2019 we have experienced, right? So this is reality. For those of you who have paid attention, July this year was the hottest month ever recorded in history, with data going back to 1880. And we could see, if you have read the news and were on online platforms, you could see people sunbathing in Alaska, and that was pretty revolutionary. And of course, here in Perth, we know that we had the warmest winter day ever in August. If we look at this wallpaper, again, if you wish, these are global data, and we can see the exact same trend here. There's a lot of cool stuff when we want to visualize climate information so it doesn't look like boring and nerdy science. So just watch this one. I hope you can see it against the black background. So this is monthly temperature change increase from 80, 50 onwards. Right? We'll see if it comes up again. There's no surprise then that we talk actually now about global heating, not just about global warming, that we talk about a climate crisis and we talk about a climate emergency, because this increase is definitely worrisome. Just take a look again. And that's a changing reality that in farming is undeniable. Now, as Anthony has nicely mentioned, I was part of the IPCC twice, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this is, if you can see the red hair sticking out underneath the orange arrow, this is me. Last year in October, after close to 30 hours quasi-non-stop negotiating with countries over the approval of the summary for policymakers on the special report of 1.5-degree warming, with a lot of resistance from Saudi Arabia predominantly, but ultimately we did get it approved, and this report is indeed a landmark. So it was initiated because the question was, well, you're all aware of the Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement says we should stay considerably below 2 degrees warming compared to pre-industrial times, better 1.5. And the question was, well, how does a 1.5-degree warmer world look like? And obviously these are averages that include both oceans and land. And it was very clear at the onset of the report that the 2-degree world, which we thought would be safe a couple of years ago, was by no means safe. And the result from this report is that a 1.5-degree warmer world is not safe either. And here are some key elements, just some figures that I want to show you from the report. So this is very small, but in essence, you just really have to read the colors. So these are increased risks from additional warming. Purple, you will see the bars popping up in just a second, mean very high and irreversible risks. And red means the risk is very high, potentially still reversible. So the systems where we can see the risks most pronounced are in warm water corals and in the Arctic. And if you can see that, well, we are already at 1.1, and at 1.5, with warm water corals, we are between the red and the purple. This is irreversible. And livelihoods in the Arctic, as well as ecological systems in the Arctic, are almost following here. 2 more graphics from the report. So this is the basic temperature graph. So as I said, we are roughly around 1.1 warming above pre-industrial times. The idea is that we limit it by 1.5. Maybe we overshoot just a little bit, or maybe more. But by the end of the century, we should be around 1.5. And the challenge is enormous. We are really worried that we will overshoot, and by overshooting, going over the average, that the consequences for both human systems and ecological systems will indeed be irreversible. Now, here is another graphic, and what that really shows is the reductions in CO2 emissions to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. You've probably heard net zero carbon by 2050 is now an aspirational goal for Western Australia. Now, how are we going to do this? These are massive efforts that are required. And if we don't want to rely on completely crazy geoengineering, and maybe we don't want to do nuclear either, what are the land options? And so here is one that people talk about a lot, but I think it needs to get more attention. This is called BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So the idea here is that we use as much land as possible to plant as many trees as possible. The trees obviously sequester carbon. The trees then can be felt, and the carbon gets into industries instead of fossil fuels. And instead of emitting the smoke and the emissions get underground. Now, BECCS is the key weapon in most scenarios that get us to 1.5. Anything that worries you about BECCS? Oh, wow, yes. Where's all that land going to come from to plant all these trees? It's easiest to plant monocultures if you want to harvest them quickly. What does that mean for biodiversity? What does that mean for the water cycle? And what does that mean for food security? So massive concerns behind that. I was not involved in the IPCC special report that just came out last month. That's the land report. I'm done with the IPCC for right now. It's incredibly interesting and incredibly difficult. So for those of you who have followed, here are the same, we call them reasons for concern, or the burning embers, For the land systems, same color scheme applies, the red and the purple, which we should worry about. So the most purple you can see, well, there are several really deep purple, dryland water scarcity, wildfires, and so on. So this is serious, my friends. This is undeniable. What was in there, which is important for us here, are the figures on agriculture, forestry, and other land use, and their contributions to greenhouse gases. So first, changing reality, we have a changing climate we have to deal with. The second changing reality is that we actually also have to focus on the contributions we make to the heating problem. So from all three combined, agriculture, forestry, and other land use, 13% of CO2, 44% of methane, and 82 nitrous oxide emissions from human activities come from these three sectors that add up to 23% of all the anthropogenic emissions. So 23% of greenhouse gases. If we include the pre- and post-production, that gets us up to almost 40%. That's enormous. And we, of course, contribute to this. Second reality we have to take into account and change. The other thing that came out of this report was a lot of emphasis on meat, red meat. Red meat is as bad as flying long distances. And just as soon as the report was released, we had this in the newspaper here, IPCC report encourages a move to plant-based diets, so how sustainable is Australian meat? Australian meat, beef in particular, is among the highest in terms of production and consumption, at par more or less with the United States and Argentina. Report says we have to globally reduce 90% of our red meat intake. What does that mean for farming? What does that mean for farmers? Earlier this year, the report came out it's a Lancet report on food and health, and it shows that we are, Charlie has shown you the planetary boundaries. Here's another example of boundaries. Here are the health boundaries. We are way beyond the intake of meat, beef, red meat, way above what is healthy. And what you can see on the brown one, well, these are starches. That's not us. These are the people I work with in most of sub-Saharan Africa. But we are nowhere close with many of the other ones that we should eat, and that, of course, has implications for what we plant and what enters our system. So if any of you are into, well, dairy farming or cattle farming, what are the options? We could do low emissions. We could look at locally produced beef and dairy that we don't transport over long distances. We could look at ethical beef that is produced with low emissions, so grass-fed. We could think about alternative emissions from maybe consuming more kangaroo meat. All this talk about insects and worms, that's where our protein comes from. We should think more seriously about veggie burgers and maybe coconut milk and almond milk. And alternatively, even if we don't want to grasp that yet, we may have to think about meat that comes out of the lab. So what does that mean for agriculture in Australia? And that takes me to Australia in terms of the climate. Here's a quick graphic, very similar to what you have heard earlier already from Richard. Australia farmland is drying, so you can see lowest on record on the red, particularly in the southwest and particularly in the east. Here's the Bureau of Meteorology graphic for the last 17 months on rainfall deficiencies. And the red, the dark, dark, dark red, is the lowest on record ever. These are enormous challenges. And then we read in the news, that was just yesterday, that the first massive relocation effort has started to get fish out from the Murray-Darling Basin somewhere else to prevent a second round of massive fish death that we saw last year. So, changing reality in terms of the climate, the realization that we contribute to emissions, and the realization that the production we have today is definitely not sustainable. Projections Here's just one quick example. We can do all kinds of cool things. This is a wonderful site you may want to use. If we look at 2050, this is a worst case scenario for the southern and southwestern flatlands. So if we're lucky, it's just going to be more or less the same. That's what the models say. But the darker one on the right-hand side, the orange, is that it could indeed be much drier, and the length of the dry periods, the droughts, could be substantially longer. So how do we work towards that future reality? How do we do that? And this brings me to the second part of this presentation, which is us. So resilience, this is a word you've seen on the slides already, but this is about resilient people. And the request that we hear left and right to become more resilient. Well, who in this room doesn't want to be resilient? Certainly something good, but the question is, can we live up to that expectation? This little cartoon came out in the New Yorker a couple of years ago saying, perception is key to resilience. Do you conceptualize an event as traumatic or as a chance to learn and grow? So somebody, the state included, is asking us to just change our mindset, to not too much worry about the harm we see, but to just be entrepreneurial, be courageous, and just be tough. I don't know how many of you know this website, Harden Up. Anybody? Harden Up Queensland is a web portal for Queensland to prepare and deal with weather extremes, climate disasters, and I think the title is telling, Harden Up, Toughen Up. There's a little side tab on that website which is called Harden Up Kids, and I think that's worrisome. In the Agricultural Competitiveness White Paper that came out in 2015, there is a little bit of that rhetoric in there. It's a narrative of people having to become resilient. And it starts by saying Australian agriculture has almost limitless potential. And now in the red, we're determined to make the sector even more competitive and to deliver practical actions that will keep our farmers and farming families profitable and resilient. The agriculture sector, like all business, must keep up and commit to continuous improvement. But our farmers, you, have the ingenuity and enterprise to do this as they always have. Wow, that's a lot of pressure. But what if not everybody can live up to that expectation, to that imaginary? And there are case studies, and these are not random case studies, in the literature I work in the field I work in, where people couldn't live up to the expectation. Anderson, 2008, big drought, the lived experience of climate change in the Mallee. And these are narrative stories of struggle, people struggling, hanging on because they expected to do so. And when it really breaks down for people, it's not when the harvest has failed. It's not when the water basins are exhausted. It's when they saw hundreds and thousands of mice coming out of the dried up fields, because that's the most depressing thing they faced. Or when the football, the netball team couldn't play anymore and the social fabric fell apart. This is when it starts hurting. Brian and Granham have written about drought and male masculinities and the impacts droughts have predominantly on male farmers. Men who are supposed to be strong and tough, the Aussie battler, supposed to be heroic, to keep it together, when often they can't, but they're not allowed either to talk to their neighbors and possibly admit failure. And my colleague Neville Ellis, who has worked with farmers in the drought in Western Australia, who talks about the ecological grief, but also the undermining self-esteem and the psychological health impacts of not being able to be resilient, not being able to live up to the expectation. And here's a sign from the Australian drought experience. If I fail as a farmer, I fail as a man. These are real examples, and I'm sure several of you in the room are familiar with those. And here are quotes, and I'm just going to read the first one, and maybe you have time for the second one. You talk to a neighbor, and knowing him hard, you used to work, to say, "You still working hard?" And you sort of look at the ground and say, "Yeah, mate, doing everything you know." They look over your block and look at the weeds everywhere and think, you can see what they're thinking. It's a shame to sort of say. It's a shame to sort of say to them, "Nah, I'm not." How can you be so active and so positive and so switched on and then turn around and say to everyone, "Guess what? I'm a loser." This matters. And the second one is about sense of place and not knowing what to do when you leave, if you can't do it. My colleague Neville Ellis works, as I said, he has worked with farmers here in the wheat belt, and he talks about a concept called Meteoranxiety, losing a sense of order in the world. When farmers desperately look at the next rainstorm on the radar, looking at the radar 10 times, 20 times a day, and here are quotes again. You're looking at the radar 15 times before it gets here, and you think, "Come on, that's a good system," and then it hasn't happened. And you look, and it's all broken up and gone. Jesus. And they say there's a 90% chance out of 10 to 20 millimeters, and you get nothing. That emotional roller coaster, I hate. I hate that one. So these are challenges that are imposed on us by a system that expects us to be resilient, but also imposed on us by our neighbors, to whom we have to prove that we are stronger than they are. And to wrap it up here, and I think this is my message, and this is maybe something that we from the social science end can contribute to this debate, and contribute to possibly focusing on people and people's resilience in regenerative agriculture. And we call this a science of loss. And the science of loss starts from the premise that not everything that we know today can be preserved for tomorrow. But we have to understand what people value and why they value it, and what particular loss would be acceptable to people, saying, "I can let this go," and what loss would people find intolerable, something they would fight for, want to protect for, and will actually sacrifice their health for. And we see that happening. But we don't understand yet well why this is. And so what we want to do, and I'll show you the project on the last slide in just a moment, is to understand how people's values, what they do, what they prefer doing, and what they want to sacrifice or potentially want to sacrifice, and what they would never sacrifice, may shift with increasing access to climate information, to technical information like regen agriculture on how to manage their systems differently, to make choices they have easier. So value trade-offs. Well, yes, regen agriculture is a choice. It's an option. But other people may look at leaving, and what does that involve? And the emotional detachment from place. Or some people may stay in place and just gear up for more, hanging on and hanging in there thinking this is all they can do. Some may be lucky and entrepreneurial enough, as the state requests from us, to become globally engaged, savvy farmers, and others may not be able to deal with the consequences of unbearable loss. So to wrap it up here, what are the opportunities for becoming more resilient? Maybe not in a way that the system, the state, expects us to be, born with resilience, but maybe learning and also admitting that we are vulnerable and that there will be losses and that this is okay. So we have a project funded by the Australian Research Council called Locating Loss from Climate Change in Everyday Places, here in Western Australia. It goes from south of Perth to the eastern wheat belt, Southern Cross. It's a transect, 400 kilometers. You see the communities up here. And we're interested not in the resilient agent, but people and communities who are resourceful. And together, we want to understand what people value, what their experiences of loss are, and how together we can shape grounded visions of adaptation pathways and development trajectories that engage with loss in place and the politics of resilience building and what that really means in people's daily lives. We use art-based workshops. We use scenario building, participatory, deliberative scenario building, and we overlay our grounded visions and adaptive futures with state-level planning for climate change. And we think this is a contribution for becoming resilient. Thank you.